From the world of AV programming and control with James King, I'm Steve Greenblatt, and this is Ask the Programmer. James, we're in for another great show, and we actually have a listener joining us today.
Oh, yeah. I'm looking forward to hearing what Stephen has to say, and this should be a good one. So Stephen and I have connected on the higher ed Slack group, and we actually got to meet in person at InfoComm as well. So it's great to actually be able to bring him in and get his viewpoint on some of these topics.
So Stephen Peacock from Texas State, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me.
So one of the things we like to ask people who are our guests are how did you come about finding out about this and what particularly keeps you listening? Because James and I are really committed to making this podcast about the listeners and about building community amongst programmers.
Oh, yeah, like James mentioned, I found the show through Higher Ed AV Slack channel, and had seen you speak at InfoComm in the past, Steve, and always looking for new places to hear different points of view from different programmers, see how other people are doing things, and trying to learn what I can learn from whoever's out there who's willing to share, and hopefully be able to share a little bit with other folks and help those that have helped me.
Wonderful. That pretty much hits it right on the mark. Is there anything in particular that you've heard that you thought either was unique to this type of a discussion, or would be something that you have passed on to other people?
I've only been able to pass on like little tidbits here and there. A lot of the big picture things have been nice to hear and kind of confirm some of the practices we've been using. Always nice to hear about other folks doing the same things, starting to get into, large scale or templated systems, as opposed to a bunch of one-offs or things like that. Kind of one of the things I've picked up, and finding the value in those sorts of things.
So more so about programming approach and strategy than actually the writing of the code, but they kind of go hand in hand sometimes. So yeah. James, you and I talked a little bit about when we were having Stephen come on, and one of the ideas came up was, how do you handle being the top person in your organization when it comes to programming? And I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about this, and then maybe see Stephen's approach to how he handles it within his organization, because it sounds like you both are like really the experts at what you do in your particular school, and for anybody who's an in-house or even a could be an independent or an integrator programmer. Many, I think, could relate to being in that situation.
Oh, yeah. So that, I think, is one of the drawbacks I feel like with my expertise in my area, is because I don't have a coworker or someone to bounce ideas off of when I'm stuck. But everyone's coming to me, or I'm sure Stephen's the same way as the programmer, going, well, we need the system to do this. Can it do this? We need to do this, and we need to do that. Can you guys do this? And it does put a lot of pressure on you, because, I mean, someone like me, we want to do the best for our students as we can. So we want to provide every resource we can so our students can get the education they need. But sometimes that's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress if you don't have someone to be able to help you out and lean on. And sometimes you fall back into your what the word I'm looking for, you're mundane, and you stick with what you know, and you don't grow and advance because you are too busy just trying to keep your head afloat.
Yeah.
So is that something that you can relate to, Stephen? And do you have any?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely have to kind of work hard and reach out there. It, like you said, it can be sort of a lonely position if you don't have a direct peer to say, hey, I did this, how would you do it? Or do you think this is possible? Kind of have to look out to the broader world to see where you can find those. I know there are a bunch of, this podcast has been an example, just hearing the things that I've heard, seeing the different folks out there that are willing to share their information. There's some Slack groups, other social media forums and groups where you can sort of get out there and try to speak to others and ask them, bounce ideas off, and then find code wherever you can, pull down someone's GitHub or thing like that and take a look at how other people are doing things, just to try to keep your, a high tide raises all ships, and try to work with that sort of thing.
So do you find that you're doing that when you're hit with a challenge, or just in general, just trying to be more broaden your mind to new ideas or different ways of doing things?
Personally, I do both. Always looking to try to make sure I'm not becoming stagnant or just doing the same thing over and over. And like James mentioned, being able to best serve my students and my clients, to be able to always get better for them. But then also there's a lot of times where I've had a problem or an issue, and you might have to go out there and take a look and say, how did you do X? I'm having a really hard time with this. So it kind of pops up in both places.
So James, do you have any thoughts that, aside from what we're doing, of course, what that you could recommend there? And is there, or do you know what others might be doing that are people have had success with?
I don't know if this is new or it's always been this way, but I do feel there are more sharing and more resources out there. Like we have our podcast here that helps, the Slack group. I mean, just the other day, someone in there posted that they were looking for a new way of controlling devices to make it more secure. And someone did point them in the right direction. And then you got all these Facebook groups and stuff out there. So I think the resources are out there and they've always been there. I just think the people are more willingly seeking that information now. And maybe that's just me, but I do feel that I see that more often. People are seeking the information. And once you start seeking, then you can start sharing. And then, like Steve was saying, all rising tides raise all boats.
Mm-hmm. So has this been a change in terms of people being more open to sharing? Has there been a less of I guess holding things close to the vest and more openness, do you think? Or do you think, is it because people are seeing the value and, give and take?
I think that's again, with me being kind of new, but coming from the IT world, IT programmers always been sharing. They weren't really hold things closer to chest. They're always out there sharing. In fact, I don't know if I mentioned this on this podcast or not, but I know my wife makes fun of me when I'm sitting there stuck on a code. I'll Google it, and there's tons of resources out there. And she's like, "You're just copying someone code. You're not coding." I'm like, "No, I know what I'm doing. I'm reading. I'm understanding." But I'm thinking AV is starting to get that. And that's, I think, because you have folks coming from the IT world, the software developers coming into the AV, and you have less of those diehard AV folks who are holding everything to their chest. I think they are learning that they basically painted themselves into a corner because they held everything to their chest and now they got stuck and they're looking for help, and everyone's like, well, you didn't help me, I'm not helping you.
Is it, would you want to follow up on that, Stephen?
Oh, yeah, no, the same sort of thing. I know, definitely feel like the AV industry is growing and evolving into a more open and sharing environment. I know when I first started, everybody was very protective of their special sauce or their spin on how they're putting on things. And back to code ownership debates quite a while ago, things like that. But now, catching up with the rest of the world and finding the value in more open and sharing information. Like James said, there's resources where you can go out and grab it. Google something, and it's not giving anything away. It's helping others and sort of sharing, because it's a very symbiotic relationship. See more and more of that grow.
It's a good way of looking at it. Have you ever had an experience of somebody who's more of a junior person that can help figure out or provide some new insight or ideas? Because it's interesting, the whole idea of mentoring, which is usually the person with more experience, but so that's kind of mentoring down. But then there's also mentoring up, where you can learn from somebody who is trying to learn from you. So it's almost like a trade, but because they come at things from a different perspective, whether they're learning something newer because they're more fresh out of school, or they're more in tune with newer ways of doing things. Because you experience could also breed habits, which we've talked about a little bit, and kind of getting set in your ways, right?
Yeah, I actually had that happen not too long ago. Gave someone else on my team a fairly tight functional spec of how things wanted to work, how some buttons needed to work on a basic push button controller. And they came back, and then we did a code review later and looked at the code, and they were far more efficient than I had been. And just out of convention, I kept doing what I had always done, what got me here. And that's really nice to sort of see and learn from someone else. He's like, oh, this was their freedom. Both the systems did the same thing at the end of the day. But being able to look at that and say, oh, there's a different way to skin that cat.
That's great. I do talk a little bit about code review, because that's one of the, we haven't had that discussed very much on the show. And I think that's a very valuable strategy, and I could see where that could really present a lot of learning opportunities.
Yeah, try to get our programming group together on a regular basis, and then sometimes have everyone bring their latest project. If you've had something you're working on, or if you had something, bring a problem to the group. If you've got something novel or different that you're having some issues with, we'll bring it into the group and throw your code up where everyone can take a look at it and say, oh, hey, I see what you're doing here, or, oh, that's really cool, here's a different way. Kind of a show and tell. We'd look through and validate the code at that point so everyone can see what's going on, how you did it, discuss if someone else has a different or novel way to do it. It's helped us maintain some standards and also be able to sort of learn as a community together and share information. Takes a little bit of time, but we're seeing some payback in that, just growing as a group and adopting practices more quickly. So it's not one guy in a corner who just figured out or solved a problem. It's now three of us that have solved a problem together.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, someone else, if you have to go troubleshoot someone else's code later, you've already seen it or had someone walk through it. So one, who did it, and two, you've been introduced to it or a style or way of doing it. So it makes it a little faster if, heaven forbid, there was a mistake and someone else has to go clean it up.
James, do you ever use something like that, or would you see that being something that could be even, cross team, where you can do a code review? so maybe you go outside of your organization and have your code reviewed.
Um, that I actually have not done anything like that, but it definitely seems like a good resource, good way of learning and helping each other out. The caveat to that, though, I think if we were to do that, I would have to probably work with like someone like Steve, or another higher ed institution who understands our end users. Because I do know, like, as I mentioned this in the past, I did send my code off to a integrator company because they were testing the equipment that they were going to install, and their programmer didn't understand why we were doing what we were doing because they don't have that daily interaction with our users. But this was a normal conversation that we had in our Slack group of almost everyone doing the same way we were doing it. So it would definitely have to be, I think, sharing among higher ed folks, but it definitely, I think that's a good idea and good way of learning, because I do know from my programming classes, and actually the one class I met my wife in, like the teacher would throw up the code when he was having a problem, and he always turned to me and goes, "James, what's wrong with my code?" And I have to look over and be like, "Oh, you're missing the semicolon here," or "This is what's wrong there."
That's interesting. So I would actually say that it's possible that you could take the functionality out of the equation and just look at it from a code standpoint, which is it's kind of the reverse, because what we're usually graded on is how does it work? If it does it work, good. Not necessarily how did you make it work? And kind of like Stephen was saying, you find new ways of doing things that even though the two solutions get you to the same place, one is probably preferred.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing. Definitely very interesting.
Any other insight you could provide there, Stephen? We're probably getting ready to wrap with regard to either this or other discussions that you think are relevant to the conversation in the audience.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay, fair enough.
Thanks.
How could people get in touch with you and learn more about what you're doing? And thank you for being on with us today. We appreciate your insight.
Sure, you can find me on LinkedIn, Stephen Peacock, and I'm with Texas State University. Learning Spaces is our group. So if you want to sort of look around, you'll see that and see what we're actually doing as a group for the university.
Wonderful. And James, another great show. Anything that stood out to you today? And then after that, just let everyone know how they can reach you.
I mean, again, it's always great to hear from our listeners, and it's great getting the feedback from Stephen and learning from the way he's doing things. Like even that code review, like every guest we had on here, I'm at least taking one nugget of information away. So it's great. So thank you again, Stephen, for coming on. As always, you guys can find me on this podcast or my writing for the Higher Ed Digital Magazine. I do. I'm on Twitter, AV_James King, LinkedIn, and you guys know how to find me.
Wonderful. And for me, you can reach me at Steve Greenblatt on social media. And I write for AV Network and also for my company blog at controlconcepts.net, and as well as the State of Control, which is an Aviation podcast at aviation.tv. And we talked about that. And I appreciate everybody listening. Please continue to provide us feedback and also reach out if you want to be a guest and you want to join the conversation. We'd be glad to have you. If you don't know how to get to this podcast, you can find us on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and most of the common platforms, but you can always reach out to us, and we definitely want to hear what you have to say, and look forward to keeping the conversation going. And that's all we have for today. And this has been Ask the Programmer.